Imagine living in a neighborhood where everything looks perfect. The lawns are trimmed, the fences match, the streets are spotless, and safety is never in question. It feels like a dream, until one decision changes everything. Today, we're stepping into the story of how a simple rooftop solar installation became the heart of an entire community's security system, and how rules meant to keep order nearly brought everything crashing down. At the edge of a busy metropolitan area sat a neighborhood that could have been lifted straight out of a glossy real estate brochure. Wide streets were bordered with freshly painted curbs. Each house followed a similar architectural pattern, modern yet modest, painted in neutral tones approved by the community board. The sidewalks were free of cracks, the driveways spotless, and flower beds bloomed in uniform shapes. On summer evenings, children's laughter echoed as they rode bicycles in tight circles around cul-de-sacs. Parents walked their dogs in neat rows, pausing to chat with neighbors about school events or upcoming barbecues. Cars rarely sped through the quiet streets, thanks to the HOA's strict enforcement of speed limits. The neighborhood wasn't just a place to live, it was a carefully managed ecosystem, engineered to look, feel, and function in perfect harmony. Behind this order stood the Homeowners Association, the HOA. It was the unseen governing body that dictated nearly every aspect of life here. The HOA controlled house paint colors, approved mailbox designs, and even sent reminders about trash can placement. For many, it was comforting, a guarantee that no single homeowner could disrupt the neighborhood's appearance or standards. For others, the HOA felt suffocating, a constant reminder that individuality came second to conformity. Among the residents was Daniel Harper, a man in his mid-40s with a sharp mind shaped by years as an electrical engineer. Daniel had moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago with his wife, Emily, and their 2 children. They were drawn by the reputation for safety, the good schools nearby, and the sense of stability the community promised. Daniel wasn't just another suburban homeowner. He was a man who believed deeply in self-sufficiency and innovation. Long before he bought this house, he had nurtured the idea of installing solar panels. To him, solar energy was more than an economic choice. It was a personal philosophy. Why rely on the grid when the sun provided more than enough? Why keep paying rising electricity bills when technology offered independence? Emily was supportive but cautious. She had heard stories of homeowners clashing with their associations over changes as minor as garden gnomes or satellite dishes. Solar panels, she feared, might stir unnecessary trouble. Daniel, however, did his homework. He combed through the HOA bylaws line by line, expecting to find restrictions. Surprisingly, at the time, there were none. The rules said nothing about solar panels, only about the uniform appearance of rooftops, siding, and landscaping. To Daniel, silence meant permission. The spring Daniel installed his panels was unusually bright, with clear skies stretching for weeks. Workers arrived early in the morning, clattering on the Harper rooftop, as neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and fences. Some watched with curiosity, others with skepticism. A few admired Daniel's boldness, whispering about following his lead. The panels themselves were sleek, jet black, and modern, covering the south-facing side of the roof where sunlight was most abundant. Within a week, the installation was complete, transforming the Harper house into the most technologically advanced home in the community. What nobody realized right away was that Daniel had gone a step further. Using his engineering background, he volunteered to integrate his system into the neighborhood's security infrastructure. It was a pilot project. A contractor had suggested that excess power from his panels could be routed to support the community's surveillance cameras, entry gate lighting, and even a backup battery system for emergencies. For the HOA board, this was initially seen as a bragging point. It cost them nothing. It made the neighborhood look forward-thinking, and it allowed them to market the community as green and secure. Daniel was proud but modest. He wasn't trying to make headlines. He just wanted to make his home and neighborhood a little safer, a little more sustainable. The years that followed reinforced the image of perfection. Every morning, Daniel checked his energy meter, satisfied to see the panels generating enough to power his household and contribute to the shared security grid. Emily grew fond of telling friends how their electricity bill had nearly disappeared. Their children boasted at school about having a house that runs on sunlight. Even the HOA seemed content. The board members often included Daniel's system in their quarterly newsletters, describing it as an example of innovation. At community meetings, some neighbors praised him, curious if they too could install panels. The HOA didn't commit to anything, but also didn't openly oppose it. Behind the scenes, though, not everyone was pleased. A handful of residents whispered about how the panels disrupted the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. To them, the glossy black rectangles stood out too much against the pale rooftops. They worried that if one homeowner was allowed to make such a bold change, others would follow. The HOA's greatest fear was chaos, a neighborhood full of mismatched roofs, gardens, and driveways. For now, those whispers didn't carry enough weight to trigger action. To understand this neighborhood, one must understand the HOA's grip on it. The association wasn't just a group of volunteers, it was a governing body with real authority. Board members could levy fines, send formal notices, and even take legal action if rules were ignored. Every resident signed binding agreements upon purchasing their homes, agreeing to abide by HOA regulations. Some of these rules were trivial, like ensuring grass never grew beyond 3 inches. Others were strict, such as prohibiting commercial vehicles from being parked overnight. The panels, though not officially restricted, represented a grey area. For years they existed as an exception, overlooked, tolerated, and even celebrated. But in systems built on control, exceptions often spark unease. For Daniel, life carried on with quiet satisfaction. He enjoyed his evening walks, nodding at the very security cameras his panels powered. He liked knowing that during storms or power outages, the cameras would remain functional. To him, this wasn't just about personal benefit, but about contributing to a collective good. He never boasted, but neighbors occasionally teased him about being the solar guy. Realtors, when showing nearby homes, pointed to Daniel's system as proof of progress. Kids used it as a school project example. To many, it symbolized innovation within tradition. Daniel assumed, perhaps naively, that everyone saw it the same way. What Daniel didn't realize was that HOA politics often ran deeper than visible smiles. Some board members had grown quietly restless. They worried not about Daniel's panels in isolation, but about precedent. If one homeowner could install panels, what would stop another from painting their house a bold color, or installing a visible satellite dish, or building a fence that clashed with the neighborhood's look? The HOA thrived on uniformity. To them, uniformity meant control, and control meant property values stayed high. To a handful of board members, Daniel's panels were no longer a badge of progress. They were a threat to authority. For now, the neighborhood still looked like paradise. Lawns gleamed in the sun, children played without fear, and Daniel's panels quietly absorbed energy, feeding not only his home, but the silent guardians above the streets. It was a picture of balance, tradition meeting technology, individuality aligning with community. But paradise is fragile, and in communities governed by rules as rigid as this one, it takes only a single decision, a single act of authority, to tip perfection into conflict. The Harpers didn't know it yet, but their life in the perfect neighborhood was about to change forever. When the neighborhood admired Daniel Harper's home from the street, most people only saw the sleek panels glinting under the sun. To them, they were a curiosity, a modern accessory on an otherwise traditional house. Few understood the real power of those panels, and even fewer realized just how critical they were to the entire community. For Daniel, the panels weren't just decoration. Each rectangle was a miniature powerhouse, silently converting sunlight into electricity. On clear days, they thrived, pulling in more energy than the Harpers could possibly use. On cloudy days, they still gathered enough to keep the house running, and in emergencies, when storms knocked out nearby power lines, the Harpers' lights continued to glow. Daniel often thought of the panels not as pieces of equipment, but as guardians, quiet, reliable, and endlessly giving. They didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't falter. They simply worked, day after day, producing the very lifeblood of modern living: electricity. The science behind Daniel's system was simple in principle, but sophisticated in execution. The panels were made of photovoltaic cells, thin slices of silicon layered to capture sunlight. When photons from the sun hit the surface, electrons inside the cells were knocked loose, creating a flow of current. That current was then channeled into an inverter, a machine that transformed the raw energy into usable electricity. From there, the electricity split into two streams. One supplied the Harper household: lights, appliances, air conditioning, and even Emily's growing collection of kitchen gadgets. The other stream, the excess, was directed to the community's security grid, a small but vital network of cameras, lights, and backup batteries scattered throughout the neighborhood. The panels, in effect, had turned the Harper home into a miniature power plant, and like all power plants, its importance extended far beyond the family who owned it. Daniel often explained to curious neighbors that solar energy wasn't just about saving money, though the savings were real and significant. It was about independence. Every watt of power his panels generated meant less reliance on the regional grid. And in a world where blackouts could strike without warning, heat waves in summer, ice storms in winter, independence meant security. He liked to remind people that when the grid went down during a storm 2 years ago, half the neighborhood sat in darkness for nearly 6 hours. Security cameras blinked off, streetlights failed, and even the gated entrance lost power. But the Harpers' home stayed lit, humming quietly as if nothing had happened. Few residents realized that it wasn't just the Harpers who benefited that night. The security cameras, too, had continued recording, powered by the surplus from Daniel's system. It was in that moment that the HOA, reluctantly, began to acknowledge the deeper value of solar energy. Not everyone celebrated it, but no one could deny its utility. Beyond independence, Daniel believed in the environmental impact. He would often cite numbers: how many pounds of carbon dioxide his panels offset each year, how many trees their output was equivalent to planting. To him, it wasn't just an engineering project, but a contribution to a larger cause. Emily, though less technical, grew to love the prestige it brought. Whenever guests visited, she proudly mentioned that their house ran on sunlight. She hosted book clubs and parent meetings, and the panels always found their way into conversation. Some neighbors rolled their eyes, others leaned in with interest. For Emily, it was a way to blend suburban life with progressive ideals. Most residents never gave a second thought to how their security system was powered. Cameras blinked above entryways, floodlights activated automatically at night, and the gated entrance always seemed to function smoothly. These small conveniences were so reliable that people forgot they depended on electricity. Behind the scenes, however, Daniel's panels were quietly feeding that system. Without his contribution, the neighborhood would have had to rely entirely on the grid, vulnerable to the same outages that had once left residents in the dark. But with solar power as a buffer, the system had become more resilient, more reliable. It wasn't a detailed Daniel broadcast, nor something the HOA printed in newsletters. For the most part, it was a quiet arrangement, an agreement between Daniel, a contractor, and a handful of board members who recognized the benefit but didn't want to draw too much attention to it. From time to time, curious neighbors asked Daniel how it all worked. He would lean against his fence, explaining in simple terms while kids chased soccer balls across the lawn. "It's like this," he'd say. "The panels make electricity whenever the sun's out. If we don't use it all, the extra flows to the security system. So, in a way, my roof is helping keep an eye on all of us." Most nodded politely, half understanding, half dismissing it as too technical, but a few were genuinely impressed. One neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, once joked, "So basically you're our unofficial power company." Daniel laughed, but the comment wasn't far from the truth. The deeper reality was this: the neighborhood had unknowingly become dependent on Daniel's panels. They weren't just saving him money, they were subsidizing everyone's safety. Each camera that watched over driveways, each light that flicked on at nightfall, each piece of backup equipment that activated during outages, all of it leaned on the power silently streaming from the Harper rooftop. It was a hidden lifeline, one nobody thought about until the day it would be threatened. What made the arrangement dangerous wasn't the technology itself, it was the assumption of permanence. People began to take it for granted. The HOA boasted in subtle ways about how reliable their security was, without acknowledging why. Residents assumed their safety net was built into the system, not realizing it was tied to one man's private project. Daniel, for his part, trusted the arrangement too much. He believed the HOA appreciated his contribution, that the board saw the benefit clearly enough to protect it. What he didn't account for was the human factor: pride, control, and the desire to maintain appearances at all costs. For now, though, the panels shone quietly in the sun, doing their work without complaint, powering both a family's dreams and a community's safety. The power of solar was more than numbers on a utility bill. It was independence, security, and sustainability rolled into one. It gave Daniel peace of mind, gave Emily pride, and gave the neighborhood protection no one fully acknowledged. But hidden beneath this quiet success was a dangerous truth. The very thing that made the neighborhood safer could also become its greatest vulnerability. And soon, that vulnerability would be tested. The Homeowners Association, often spoken of as a faceless entity, was in reality a group of residents who had been elected, or in some cases volunteered, to manage the community. They were not strangers but familiar faces: the retired teacher who walked her dog each morning, the real estate agent always eager to sell another house in the neighborhood, the young accountant who treated bylaws like sacred texts. To many, these board members represented stability. They made sure the streets were paved, that seasonal decorations didn't get out of hand, and that property values stayed competitive. But behind closed doors, the board was less about community and more about control. Meetings were filled with discussions about what colors were acceptable for shutters, which types of grass seed could be used, and how to handle violations from residents who dared to step out of line. And though Daniel Harper had once been quietly celebrated for his solar panels, murmurs began to circulate among these board members. The HOA's rules were a thick binder, stacked high with amendments, footnotes, and resolutions passed over the years. Most residents only skimmed them when moving in, signing their names without realizing just how deep the regulations ran. But the board knew every page. They could quote clauses from memory, using them as both shield and sword when disputes arose. One of the unwritten codes of the board was T.E. at first. Objections to Daniel's panels were little more than whispers over backyard fences. A neighbor would grumble that the panels reflected too much light in the morning. Another would suggest that they made the Harper home look different from the rest. These complaints eventually reached the ears of board members. Though none of them could deny the panel's usefulness, especially after the power outage 2 years ago, they began to worry about what might happen if more residents followed suit. Would the rooftops one day be covered in mismatched panels, some old, some new, some angled awkwardly? Would the community's polished image dissolve into a patchwork of technology and individuality? The board thrived on precedent. Allowing Daniel to keep his panels without restriction might set one they couldn't control later. and control was something the HOA was unwilling to lose. The idea of uniformity. To them, the neighborhood's strength came from consistency, lawns neatly cut to the same height, houses painted in variations of beige and gray, roofs matching under the sun. Anything that disrupted that uniformity was treated as a threat, no matter how minor. Daniel's solar panels were not written into the rules. That was the problem. Their silence on the matter left room for interpretation, and interpretation gave the board power. Conflicts between HOAs and residents were hardly new. Stories of battles over mailbox sizes, holiday decorations, and even the length of grass were common in suburbs across the country. National news occasionally picked up on extreme cases. Homeowners sued over planting the wrong kind of flowers, retirees fined for installing ramps for their disabilities. The HOA model was designed to protect property values, but too often it became a battleground for power and pettiness. Some residents saw their HOAs as tyrants, micromanaging lives for the sake of appearances. Others defended them fiercely, claiming they were the only reason their neighborhoods remained orderly and desirable. Daniel was not the type to seek conflict, but as an engineer, he valued logic. To him, solar panels were practical, efficient, and beneficial to all. To the HOA, they were a dangerous exception. It was only a matter of time before those two perspectives collided. Board meetings, once dull gatherings about landscaping contracts and parking policies, began to shift in tone. Conversations about Daniel's panels crept into agendas, sometimes indirectly, other times head-on. One evening, the board gathered in the clubhouse, papers stacked neatly in front of them, voices hushed but firm. "They're too noticeable," said one member, flipping through photographs she had taken of the Harper home. "We need to think about long-term uniformity." Another countered, "But those panels power our security. Do we really want to risk upsetting the homeowner who's footing part of our safety bill?" The president of the board, a man named Richard Lawson, listened quietly before speaking. "It's not about Daniel personally. It's about the rules. If we don't address this, others will demand the same. And then where do we draw the line?" The room fell silent. The decision wasn't made that night, but a seed had been planted,